Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, a Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, speaking to you from Brussels. Many of you will be too young to remember the 1980s, but at that time there was an important meeting in Saudi Arabia in the city of Taif, which led to the very famous Taif Agreement among the Gulf Arab states, that none of them would have any dealings with Israel, let alone recognize the state of Israel, until a viable two-state solution had been found for Israel and the Palestinians. Of course, this agreement came a little bit like closing the stable door after the horse had bolted, because in 1980, Egypt agreed a peace treaty with Israel, and Israel withdrew its troops from the Sinai. And a few years later, Jordan did the same. But these two pieces were known as cold pieces because they did not lead, at least initially, to much diplomatic contact, let alone economic exchanges between Israel and its two most immediate neighbors. But for many years, the Gulf Arabs really seemed to be holding firm. I well remember as a NATO official that when I traveled to Israel, I would always ask the customs officers not to stamp my passport, because if I had an Israeli stamp in my passport, it was very difficult for me thereafter to travel on to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. But in the last couple of weeks, something truly surreal, spectacular has happened. 3 weeks ago, the United Arab Emirates agreed to open diplomatic relations with Israel. And the first Israeli aircraft took off from Tel Aviv to fly to Abu Dhabi. And then just this week, a second Gulf state, Bahrain, has also followed the United Arab Emirates in opening diplomatic contacts with Israel. Yesterday, the Israeli Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, spoke to his counterpart in Bahrain and invited him to visit Israel very soon. So this does not mean that all of the other Gulf countries are going to follow suit in short order. The Saudis have traditionally been more hesitant. Oman has good relations with Iran. And Qatar has been much more supportive of the Palestinians and some radical Islamist movements in the Middle East. It's also embroiled currently in a dispute with the Gulf countries, so it may not follow suit either. But nonetheless, this has given President Trump, let alone the beleaguered Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, much needed diplomatic victories, particularly President Trump as he faces an election in just a couple of weeks' time. Indeed, a few days ago, President Trump also proclaimed that he had persuaded Serbia and Kosovo also to recognize Jerusalem as the future capital of Israel, something that would put them at loggerheads with EU policy, which is currently not to agree to that until a peace agreement has been signed. So, what is going on? Well, clearly there are some reasons that explain this diplomatic shift by the Gulf states. First and foremost, there is the common fear of Iran, which is going back to producing nuclear weapons and which has spread its tentacles across Syria and Iraq, Lebanon, and throughout the Middle East. Secondly, there is fear of the Arab Spring. It may have died down a little bit since the giddy days of 2011, but these rather conservative regimes are always looking over their shoulder, and this is perhaps the time to draw closer to the United States and to Israel. Moreover, they depend on the United States for their military supplies. Saudi Arabia has given contracts to the United States totaling a massive $60 billion if all of those arms sales are realized. And as the Saudis become more bogged down in Yemen, they're ever more dependent upon American protection and technology. Also, in exchange for agreeing to open talks with Israel, it appears that the United Arab Emirates has secured the possibility of buying the latest American fighter planes, the Joint Strike Fighter F-35s. This worries Israel a little bit because the US has always promised that it will have the famous qualitative military edge over all of its Arab rivals. Also, Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed, at least for now, not to push forward with the annexation in the West Bank of certain Israeli settlements. But it's also very much down to frustration with the Palestinians, who for years have remained divided between Hamas and Fatah, Gaza versus the West Bank, postponed their elections, have been really unable to move forward with their peace negotiations with Israel. Where does this leave the European Union? Well, frankly, in a difficult position. It seems that two major blocs or camps, rather worryingly, are now forming in the Middle East. A bloc with the United States, Israel, and the Gulf Arab conservative states on the one hand, facing Iran, and on the other, a bloc that could bring Turkey, Russia, Iran, perhaps Lebanon, maybe Iraq tomorrow, who knows, together in the opposite camp, armed to the teeth and increasingly pursuing geographical rivalry. The European Union has been very much piggy in the middle for many years on this, trying to push for the two-state solution, trying to keep nuclear talks open with Iran, condemning human rights abuses such as the recent assassination of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi. But as it gets squeezed between the two camps, does it maintain this even-handed position in order to have some influence in the Middle East, or does it go increasingly with this US Gulf-Israel alliance? This is going to be a very difficult choice for Brussels, but simply wringing one's hands in despair over one's lack of influence isn't going to be enough. The EU badly needs a policy to protect its interests and its values in the broader Middle East. Thank you very much for watching. That's it for this week, and I look forward to engaging with you once again next week. Goodbye for now.